Moving on to the other big story we're debating today, the UK is all set to clamp down on public protests by way of a new public order bill. To give police more powers to stop, quote, disruptive protests even before they begin, the legal definition of serious disruption is being expanded in a bit to, as Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said, stop a, quote, disruptive minority who use tactics such as blocking roads or slow marching. Sunak believes the public and business will support the government's efforts to stop protesters causing serious disruption following a series of high-profile protests by groups such as Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain. The changes would mean that the police would not need to wait for disruptions to take place and can shut protests down even before any chaos is caused. Now, this is relevant in India because countries like the UK and their lawmakers often judge India, even call it autocratic, when police here acts on such disruptive protests. In fact, many countries mounted criticism on India despite its very lenient action on protests such as farm bills or CAA legislation that blocked arterial roads for months. Take a look at repeated Western hypocrisy over matters in India versus how they react to matters at home. The UK MPs condemned India for its treatment of farmer protests, even though by and large the government did not act on them despite public anger. But at home, they are set to pass a law to crack down on blockades and protests. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said he stood with, quote, peaceful protesters on farm bill agitation in India. Remember what he did at home? He stopped truckers' peaceful protests while adding that no one has the right to block. Take a look at Germany's hypocrisy. Its foreign minister recently batted for a UN role on Kashmir situation, this after speaking to its Pak counterpart. At home, their internal minister pledged tough approach against enemies of the state so they can do what they need to do for security, but India can't. Doesn't this latest action coming in the UK, where a new law is going to be passed, completely expose the Western hypocrisy on India? Guests joining us, Sushant Sareen, Senior Fellow, ORF, Dr. Makrant R. Paranjpe, Professor, JNU and political commentator, Professor David Dunn from the Department of Political Science, University of Birmingham, also joining us. Let me begin with Dr. Paranjpe. The hypocrisy is writ large, and there are so many more issues I could have quoted than the three examples I gave to talk about the Western hypocrisy. And do you believe that the Indian public also now needs to see through it, or at least those who quote such comments that come from overseas on what India is doing, for example, more specifically on protests in India? We know what the farm law bills were and how the protest was mounted. We know what the anti-CAA protests were and how they were mounted. They supported that in India, which disrupted Indian economy, Indian movement, mobility. And this was also a minority section. It was not the majority of the public up in arms. And yet different standards at home.
Yes, absolutely. There is a history to this, as we all know. Liberalism at home and despotism abroad. That has been the history of colonialism and imperialism. And the double standards are very well known. I think, though, that the issue is slightly different, which is we must separate what lawmakers are saying, different lobbyists are saying, from what the government says, and then what the press says. Yeah. We also know that the press coverage of India is really negative. And this makes us think rather deeply about the forces, behind the curtains, which are manipulating public opinion. And finally, a kind of internal civil war in India itself, and not so civil, I would say, because it's not really fisticuffs, but the right versus left battle, which supports everything that is anti-government. Now, as fellow democracies, we can actually take a leaf out of Britain by making a distinction between the right to protest, which is fundamental to democracy, but trampling on other people's rights, blocking the traffic, blocking roads. We saw this in the farmers' protest for over a year.
Yes.
The public was inconvenienced. And in UK, it's ironic that these people who are marching are actually adding to the pollution and the global warming, even though they are protesting against petroleum. So by slowing down traffic, they're doing exactly the opposite of what they profess to do, which is to bring down the consumption of petrol or petroleum products. So I want to end my intervention by actually pointing out that democracies themselves are under threat. And there are many authoritarian regimes which are trying to say that we offer peace and we are more attractive, we control, public opinion. That's not the way to go. I think we have to cut across party lines and learn from each other. And tomorrow, if there are farmers' protests again in India, which I'm told are going to be, I hope the government also has courage to disband them and take
Before they dig in their heels.
anticipatory action. Take anticipatory action.
No, but imagine the furor, Dr. Paranjpe, there will be in India if there was anticipatory action, which the new UK law is set to give police the powers for. In India, as you very rightly mentioned, even after a year, and, Rishi Sunak very rightly says, I'm not objecting to what he has said. He said, there is a person trying to go to the hospital for cancer treatment. There is a mother trying to take her kid to school, and their rights cannot be held to ransom by a minority protesting. But that's exactly what we were saying in India, isn't it, Sushant? All of us.
We can cite this law, actually, or we can cite this precedent in UK and try and do something similar if required, while calling out hypocrisy and double standards at the same time.
Even then it will not fly, at least for some, I would say, even if this precedent was there. Yes, Sushant.
Yeah, I think you're right, Shivani. It won't fly because most of the noises which come from the West are very self-serving. For example, even as we are speaking, there have been massive protests in Gwadar, where the Chinese are building a port and the locals are being deprived. Have you heard Justin Trudeau get his knickers in a twist over that protest? Or have you heard any of the Western countries tell Pakistan, where the Corps commander out there has said, anybody who protests, I'll throw them all in jail? Have you heard any of these Western guys say anything? Because Pakistan, Islamic exceptionalism and all of that, right? Even in India. But, Shivani, frankly, the West will do what the West does. It has this condescending attitude. It has this superciliousness about it, that we know what democracy is. You black people don't know anything. All of that is given. That's a set thing as far as these guys are concerned. But, I think it also, it boggles my mind why, governments in India look for some kind of validation from the West. So, for example, when the Shaheen Bagh protesters had blocked a major arterial road, what prevented the government of India from acting against those guys?
Because it was the minority in question. They don't want to be seen as anti-minority.
No. Anybody did that prevent Justin Trudeau from breaking up the truckers' protest, which was entirely peaceful? I don't think the farm protests were peaceful, but the truckers' protests were entirely peaceful. And look at the way. And did you see any of these supercilious, Western countries say anything to Justin Trudeau the way he broke up and he imposed emergency measures? Nothing. So I don't see any reason why a government in India, if people are inconveniencing other citizens, they are they are preventing other citizens from going about their daily lives. Why was the government of India in the city of Delhi quiet? Why did
I've asked that question repeatedly of the government, and maybe this will serve as a reminder that actually even in India there was public anger against these protests. Yet the government allowed that anger to fester and people to suffer. I have questioned the BJP government on that.
No, but Shivani, the problem is that even now, and I have very deep respect for the professor, but even now we are saying that, okay, fine, now that the British have passed this law, maybe we can use that. We have done, this is exactly the rationale we gave, for example, in the case of CAA.
Okay.
The Americans can prioritize whom they will give citizenship to, which refugee they will give citizenship to. But if India does it, Indian democracy is in danger, dictatorship has taken over, India has become a fascist state. I don't know which world these people live in.
No, so
And don't
the
they know the kind
fundamental.
of religious persecution which is happening in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh?
Absolutely. No,
Don't they not know
the
it?
reason, Sushant, I'm discussing this is precisely for this reason, that we don't need Western validation. I think we are moving ahead in that regards. But the public in India also needs to be aware that the way some of these issues are sold to them, that they are anti-democracy
Shivani, I'll take
or
half a minute.
anti-constitution, is not so. Governments across the world are doing what they're doing. Sushant, I'll allow you to
Shivani,
come
half
in.
a minute. Half
Yeah,
a minute.
okay, okay.
Half a minute. I think the people of this country are wise enough to know what if the government is taking action or is not taking action, and the validity of that action. The problem is not with the people. The problem is with the people who are more beholden to the Western societies and people who act as agents of the West and who have imbibed that book by Gene Sharp, which tells you how to protest and how to bring governments down.
Okay.
This is something that the West has foisted on other countries. And when Russia and other countries play the similar games in the West, these guys scream blue murder, as though some grave injustice has happened.
Yeah, this is called,
These guys
there is this,
interfere in other countries, but they will not, let anybody else interfere in their country.
Fair enough.
Which is fair enough.
Which is fair enough. Actually, they're doing what they need to do. And if the public has an objection, that public should object to their government. But other governments should not object to what is happening in my country is my central point. This guerrilla warfare or guerrilla protesting that has almost come into vogue, which is basically an umbrella of all of these protests, where you block, you slow march, you basically don't let some of the functioning of the government or of the authorities of the citizenry happen. That is what is coming under question globally, and I'm thankful for that. But Professor Dunn, I want to come to you. What do you think has necessitated this new law, and in combination of others, these steps that the UK government is taking? And is there by and large public support for this?
So I think it's important to make a distinction between a protest and a disruption. We're very happy in the UK to support the right to protest, to march, to raise placards, to show support for an issue by the number of people that are there and the willingness of that numbers of people to actually walk down the street and to raise attention to an issue. That's limited in time and in scope, and the point isn't to disrupt. The reason why new laws are being brought in the United Kingdom is that the new activities of some protesters, Say No to Oil and Insulate Britain and various other environmental groups, they are designed to have a disruptive impact, to actually cause the economy to come to a halt, rather like the very long protests in Canada. And that's a distinction I think is important, is the length of time that the truckers in Canada were trying to actually block the border. It wasn't a protest, it was an attempt at disruption. And that's what's happening in the UK, whereby people are locking themselves with chains to railings, they're gluing themselves to the road, and often actually the number of protesters can be tiny. I myself was in London and I saw 4 people lie down in the road, and the police were there, but they felt, well, they were legally unable to move them because they were involved in an act of protest. But the 4 people didn't represent anything other than the 4 people who were lying in the road. So the numbers were small, the impact was disproportionate, and the time that they were there was huge. And the aim of it was disruption, not protest. And that's an important distinction.
No, we agree with you. We agree with you. We have protests in India all the time. It is particularly disruptive protests that, the public had anger against. Is there anger against such protests in UK too? Very quickly, sir.
Yes, absolutely. There's anger. There's anger in the UK because, as you say, and I was listening to a radio report this morning where a father and son were due to be pallbearers at his father's funeral and were unable to get there because of protests in the road. People are fed up with this type of protest. When there was an attempt to actually glue themselves to, and climb on top of a tube train, the mob almost rioted at these protesters, stopping them getting to their work, stopping them getting to where they wanted to go to.
Okay.
So actually the population as a whole is fed up of protesters who are not just protesting, but actually disrupting.
They're disrupting other people's lives, especially on causes the larger public actually does not agree with. The larger public has no truck with them on these issues. I have final minute left. I'll give a 30 seconds to Professor Paranjpe and then Sushant Sareen.
Yeah, I just want to say I agree with my co-panelists and what Sushantji also said earlier. See, the point is that we've had this going on in India for a very long time. Look at Kundakalam. They disrupted the nuclear power reactor. They threw out from, they threw out Sterlite. So these are, to me, motivated and planned ways to sabotage the economy and the government of India, actually. The only thing I wanted to say is that democracies across the world are facing similar threats. So there should be a way to come together on some of these issues rather than being sectarian about them.
Yeah.
And the sooner we decolonize, the better. But you can't just blame a small section, let's say, of the intelligentsia, because what was the government doing during farm protests?
Fair enough.
So this is a much more complicated issue, is what I'm saying. It's very easy to
you're
target.
actually right about the fact that in India, somehow a lot of these protests are given legitimacy as a voice of democracy, of the downtrodden, of the oppressed. But actually, a lot of these protests are not that. They are these protests in the guise of the downtrodden and the oppressed. Sushant Sareen, final 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, Shivani, number one, I must tell the professor from the UK that, this distinction which he makes between disruptive protests and the normal protests, what exactly were the farm protests? Were they not disruptive? For 1 year they went on. They blocked the national highway to Delhi. They caused a loss of hundreds of thousands of crores. These are people who were they carried out murders out there. There were all kinds of other activities, disruptive activities that were carried out. They used to sit and block trains for almost a year. Trains could not travel to Punjab. Is that not disruption? And then you have this Justin Trudeau and these other fellows, including in the British Parliament, comment on Indian policies. What was that all about?
Yeah, I quoted that MPs in the UK objected to India's crackdown. I don't know what crackdown happened. There was no crackdown here. Professor Dunn, you want to respond? I barely have 20 seconds.
Well, I'm not familiar with the protests in India, I have to say, but I think the distinction is a useful one to apply. But it sounds in that case that they were disruptive, and therefore they would fall foul of the new law in the UK as well.
Yes, but it was possibly geopolitics that made a lot of these countries criticize India. They do it day in, day out when it comes to human rights, minorities, and protests. But look at what they're doing at home. I've run out of time. I do thank our guests for joining us. Time for a very short break. On the other side, we'll get to the day's biggest updates.